The carousel still turns. It sits in Johnson City, New York, free to ride, just like it was in 1920. The man who built it also built 4 hospitals, 12 tanneries, 62 factories, and employed 1 in 5 residents of the entire region. At its peak, his company made 52 million pairs of shoes in a single year and controlled 52% of the American work shoe market. Then, it made nothing. Not overnight, not from one bad decision. Over 25 years, one of the most dominant industrial empires in American history quietly collapsed, while its own management watched it happen and couldn't stop it. The reason why is not what you'd expect. This company did almost everything right. It paid better wages than anyone. It built free hospitals for its workers. It was beloved by its community. It was, by any measure, a model of how industrial capitalism should work. And that's exactly what destroyed it. George Frank Johnson was born in 1857 in Milford, Massachusetts, the son of a shoe worker. Not a shoe merchant, not a factory owner, a shoe worker, a man who performed specific, repetitive operations on specific components of a shoe day after day in the modest shop environment that characterized the Massachusetts shoe industry in the years before full mechanization transformed it into something unrecognizable. This origin is not incidental. It is the key to understanding everything that followed. The biographies of most Gilded Age industrial titans begin at a comfortable remove from actual production. Carnegie came from poverty, but understood his industry from the perspective of a manager and investor from relatively early in his career. Rockefeller never refined oil himself. Ford's genius was organizational and engineering, not manual. The distance between these men and the physical act of making things gave them a strategic perspective that was genuinely valuable. The ability to see the industry from above, to think about it in terms of capital flows and market structures and technological trajectories, rather than in terms of daily production realities. Johnson's distance from the factory floor was 0. He grew up watching his father perform the same motion thousands of times a day for wages that left no margin and no room for aspiration. He understood from childhood exactly what the extractive model of industrial capitalism felt like from the inside. The vulnerability, the expendability, the way a man's entire economic existence could be disrupted by decisions made by people who had never met him and would never have to look him in the eye. He left school at 14, not from indifference to learning, but from economic necessity. The family needed income, and he was old enough to provide some. He worked in Massachusetts shoe shops for 2 years, absorbing the logic of the industry with an attention that went well beyond what was required for his immediate tasks. He watched where value was created in the production process. He watched where it was captured and by whom. He developed opinions about the relationship between the quality of a workforce and the quality of a product that were, for a 16-year-old factory hand in the 1870s, unusually precise. In 1881, at 24, he arrived in Binghamton, New York, hired as a general worker at the Lester Brothers Shoe Factory. The southern tier of New York was not yet a manufacturing center of any significance, but it had geographic and demographic qualities that Johnson, within his first weeks, recognized as underutilized. Hemlock bark for tanning was abundant in the surrounding forests. The Susquehanna River provided water and transportation access. Land was cheap. Labor, drawn from waves of Central European immigration that had been depositing Polish, Slovak, Hungarian, and Italian families in the region throughout the 1870s, was plentiful, willing, and largely unskilled in ways that Johnson understood could be remedied quickly with proper training and proper incentives. His rise within the Lester Brothers operation was rapid in the way that genuine competence tends to be rapid when it encounters an environment that has been managed at a lower level of quality than it is capable of. Within 3 years, he was factory superintendent. Within 7, he had become a partner. The mechanisms of this ascent were straightforward. He was demonstrably better at every aspect of shoe manufacturing than anyone around him. He worked with an intensity that contemporaries described as alarming, and he possessed a combination of operational precision and human intuition that is rare in any era, and was essentially without precedent in the shoe industry of the 1880s. He could optimize a production line, restructure the sequence of operations, adjust the incentive structure, reconfigure the physical layout, and then walk the floor afterward and know, from the way men held their shoulders or the pace at which they moved between stations, whether the optimization had cost something in morale that would eventually cost something in quality. This sensitivity to the human texture of industrial production was not sentimental. It was analytical. Johnson understood workers as a variable in a production function, but he understood the variable with a precision and completeness that his contemporaries, who also treated workers as variables, entirely lacked. The key insight, the one that would eventually make Endicott Johnson the largest shoe manufacturer in the world, was this: the cost of treating workers badly was not zero. It appeared on no ledger in any immediately legible form, but it was real. Turnover cost money. Resentment cost quality. Exhaustion cost precision. The extractive model, which presented itself as pure efficiency, was actually expensive in ways that nobody was measuring, because nobody had designed their accounting systems to capture those costs. Johnson designed his around them. The formal founding of what would become Endicott Johnson Corporation traces to 1890, when Johnson and his business partner, Henry B. Endicott, reorganized the Lester Brothers operation into a new entity with reorganized capital and a reorganized purpose. The initial capitalization was approximately $200,000, roughly $6.5 million in today's dollars. Modest by the standards of the era's great industrial consolidations, but sufficient for what Johnson intended, which was not to create a financial structure, but to create a system. The partnership between Johnson and Endicott worked because the two men brought genuinely complementary capabilities that did not overlap or compete. Endicott brought capital, Eastern financial connections, and a comfort with the language and mechanisms of business finance that Johnson, despite his intelligence, had never particularly cultivated. Johnson brought everything else: production mastery, worker relationships, operational vision, and the developing philosophy of labor relations that would become the company's most powerful and most problematic inheritance. That philosophy, which Johnson called the square deal, borrowing Theodore Roosevelt's language but giving it content that Roosevelt's political rhetoric never quite achieved, rested on a premise that was, in the context of 1890, American manufacturing, genuinely radical. The premise was simple. Treating workers well was not charity, it was strategy. A stable, experienced, motivated workforce would produce better shoes at lower per unit cost than a constantly churned pool of desperate, replaceable hands. And the savings generated by stability would more than offset the higher wages and benefits required to maintain it. This was not a moral position that happened to have economic justification. It was an economic position that also happened to align with Johnson's personal values, which is a much more durable combination. Positions held purely on moral grounds are vulnerable to the pressure of adverse economic circumstances. Positions held on economic grounds can be maintained even when circumstances become difficult, because they continue to generate the returns that justify them. The first major test came in 1892 when a labor dispute shut down several large New England shoe manufacturers. EJ, which had already established a regional reputation for fair wages and humane treatment, attracted skilled workers who had walked off those floors, men with years of experience, trained in the precise operations of shoe manufacturing, bringing with them expertise and institutional knowledge that took years to develop and could not be quickly replicated in the workers available from the general labor pool. The quality advantage this influx created was measurable in market response within 18 months. EJ shoes, already competitive in quality, became demonstrably superior to the output of factories that had lost their experienced workforce to strikes and replacements. Retail buyers noticed. Repeat orders increased. The market share gains of 1893 and 1894 were directly traceable to a workforce management decision made not in response to the 1892 dispute but in the years before it, as a matter of principle. Johnson did not experience this as ideological vindication. He experienced it as a data point, and he proceeded from it empirically, doing more of what worked, adjusting what didn't, watching results rather than theories. The physical expansion of the operation in the 1890s was substantial but disciplined. New factories were built as production capacity was genuinely needed, not speculatively. Each new facility was placed within the regional cluster in the southern tier, reinforcing the operational logic of proximity. Workers could walk between facilities, supervisors could oversee multiple locations, quality standards could be maintained across the expanding operation without losing the coherence that Johnson believed was essential. By 1900, the company was producing approaching 6 million pairs of shoes annually. It employed approximately 4,000 workers. It was profitable, growing, and beginning to attract the kind of attention from industry observers and business journalists that signals a company becoming something more than regional. The foundations had been laid. What was built on them over the next 2 decades would be unlike anything American manufacturing had seen before. Between 1900 and 1920, Endicott Johnson Corporation constructed a complete parallel society organized around employment, an integrated system of production, welfare, and community development that was simultaneously a business strategy, a social experiment, and an expression of one man's deeply held beliefs about what industrial capitalism could and should look like. The concrete elements of the square deal accumulated gradually over these years, each addition representing both a moral commitment and an investment that Johnson expected to pay returns. Wages ran consistently 15 to 20% above industry average throughout this period, a premium substantial enough to make EJ employment genuinely desirable in competitive labor markets, but never so high as to make the operation economically non-viable. The wage premium was funded, in Johnson's accounting, by the productivity advantage that stable employment created. He tracked this with a precision that would have surprised anyone who assumed his generosity was simply a form of organized altruism. Medical care came early, a company-funded clinic that evolved through the first decade of the century into a full hospital, staffed by physicians employed by the company, providing treatment at no cost to employees and their immediate families. The health benefit addressed a specific vulnerability that Johnson had observed in working-class life, that a single serious illness, untreated because of cost, could destroy a family's economic stability in ways that took years to repair, making workers anxious, debt-burdened, and less productive. Free medicine was not just humane. It removed a source of chronic economic anxiety that degraded the quality of working life and, by extension, the quality of work. The parks came because Johnson believed that a community without recreational space was a community under unnecessary stress. He funded the construction of several parks across the Triple Cities, including ball fields, picnic facilities, and landscaped grounds that were open to all employees and their families without charge or condition. The Country Club, an institution that in the early 20th century was exclusively associated with wealth and social exclusivity, was built on the same democratic model. Membership was free to EJ employees, and the facilities were genuinely comparable in quality to private clubs that served wealthy members elsewhere. The carousels, the detail that tends most to surprise people encountering this history for the first time, came from Johnson's conviction that pleasure was not a luxury that only wealthy people deserved. He installed 4 full-size carousels at 4 different points in the community, operated them free of charge, and maintained them at company expense as a permanent feature of community life. The gesture was theatrical, but it was not merely theatrical. It was a visible, daily physical statement of values, a reminder, accessible to every child in the Triple Cities on any given afternoon, that the company that employed their parents considered their happiness a legitimate concern. By 1910, the workforce had grown to 12,000 people across 31 factories. Annual production had reached approximately 25 million pairs of shoes. EJ controlled roughly 35% of the American work shoe market, a concentration that was already remarkable, but that would continue to grow for another decade and a half. The regional economic impact of this concentration was staggering. EJ was not merely the largest employer in the Triple Cities. It was, effectively, the economic foundation of the entire region. Local merchants, service providers, landlords, and professionals all depended, at varying removes, on the wages that EJ generated and the spending those wages supported. The regional economy had become a function of one company's health, which meant, unavoidably, that the company's decisions were not purely business decisions. They were civic decisions, with consequences that extended far beyond any quarterly earnings report. Johnson understood this, and he embraced it. The community and the company in his vision were not separate entities with occasionally conflicting interests. They were the same entity, viewed from different angles. A company that exploited its community was a company that was destroying its own foundations. A company that invested in its community was a company investing in itself. The theory was coherent. The practice was remarkable. And embedded within both was a set of assumptions about stability, about the permanence of leather, about the continued relevance of skilled human labor, about the geographic centrality of northeastern manufacturing, that would prove, in time, to be the theory's fatal flaw. The 1920s represent Endicott Johnson at its absolute maximum, a period of production, employment, and market dominance that has no parallel in the subsequent history of the American shoe industry, and that, even in the context of the extraordinary industrial expansion of the decade, stands as a remarkable achievement. Annual production peaked at approximately 52 million pairs of shoes in 1927. Write that number out and consider what it means. 52 million pairs of shoes, produced in 1 year, by one company, in a 30-mile radius of Binghamton, New York. The factories ran multiple shifts. The tanneries processed more leather than any comparable operation in North America. The workforce had reached 22,000 employees, a number that, in a region with a total population of approximately 100,000, meant that virtually every family in the Triple Cities had a direct connection to EJ employment. To put the market position in perspective, at 52% of the American work shoe segment, EJ was not merely a dominant company. It was functionally the American work shoe industry. Every other producer competed in the margins of a market that EJ defined. Miners in Pennsylvania, steelworkers in Pittsburgh, construction workers in Baltimore and Boston, longshoremen in New York and Philadelphia. A majority of all of them, when they laced their boots in the morning, were wearing shoes that had been cut, stitched, lasted, and finished somewhere in the southern tier of New York State. The physical infrastructure required to support this scale of production was, by any measure, extraordinary. The 12 tanneries, the largest of which covered several acres of floor space, processed hides sourced from EJ's own farm, as well as purchased stock from across the country and from South America. The wire factory produced the eyelets and grommets that went into millions of pairs of shoes annually. The railroad spur moved raw materials in and finished goods out with a logistics efficiency that rivaled anything operating in American industry at the time. The vertical integration was not merely a cost strategy. It was a quality control strategy. By owning every stage of the supply chain from rawhide to finished shoe, EJ could enforce standards at each step that external procurement could not guarantee. The leather in an EJ work shoe was processed to EJ specifications by EJ workers in EJ tanneries. The stitching was performed by EJ workers whose skill levels EJ had developed and maintained over years of employment. The quality was not the result of inspection at the end of the line. It was baked into the structure of production. George Johnson, now in his 60s, remained an active presence on factory floors throughout the decade, walking the lines, talking to workers, maintaining the direct connection to production reality that had been the source of his strategic insight from the beginning. The accounts of workers who remembered him from this period describe a man who was both physically imposing and genuinely interested, who asked questions about specific operations and listened to the answers, who remembered individual workers' names across facilities with a recall that seemed impossible given the scale of the operation, who communicated by his presence a message that no employee handbook could have carried, that the work being done on these floors mattered, and that the people doing it mattered, and that the man who had built all of this knew both of those things and had not forgotten them. In 1919, profit sharing was introduced, a program that distributed a percentage of annual earnings directly to workers based on tenure and position. The timing was deliberate. The post-World War I period was producing significant labor unrest across American industry, with strikes and organizing activity that reflected workers' determination to claim a portion of the wartime prosperity that they felt had been generated on their backs. Johnson's response was characteristically preemptive. He institutionalized the sharing before it was demanded, framing it not as a concession to pressure, but as a recognition of what workers had always been owed. In September 1920, he gathered his workforce in staggered assemblies across facilities because no single space could hold everyone, and made the pledge that would hang over every subsequent strategic discussion for the next 40 years. He would not move the factories south. He would not chase cheaper labor. The company was built here by these people, and it would remain here. The workers who heard it believed him. They had reason to. Everything Johnson had done for nearly 4 decades supported the credibility of the commitment. The hospital was real. The carousels were real. The wages were real. The profit sharing was real. When this man said something, it tended to be true. What none of them could fully account for, what Johnson himself, in his 76th year, perhaps could not fully see, was how completely the world in which the pledge made sense was already beginning to change. The competitive pressure from Southern manufacturers had been visible to anyone paying close attention since the early 1920s, but it had the quality of a distant storm, present on the horizon, acknowledged in trade publications and industry reports, but not yet felt as an immediate threat by an operation as dominant and as deeply entrenched as Endicott Johnson. The mathematics of the Southern advantage were straightforward and, in retrospect, should have been alarming earlier than they were. Labor costs in Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas ran 30 to 40% below New York levels in the early 1920s, a gap that widened through the decade as northeastern unionization strengthened while Southern manufacturing remained largely unorganized. The quality differential between Northern and Southern production, which had been substantial in the early years when Southern manufacturers were still developing their workforce capabilities, was narrowing steadily as Southern operations matured and accumulated experience. What the Southern producers lacked in the 1920s was brand recognition and established distribution relationships. Retail buyers who had been purchasing EJ work shoes for years had no particular reason to switch to an unfamiliar product from an unfamiliar manufacturer, especially when EJ's quality was genuinely superior. The switching costs were not just financial. They were relational, built into the structures of long-standing business partnerships that EJ had carefully cultivated. This brand and relationship advantage was real but not permanent. It was the kind of advantage that erodes gradually, almost imperceptibly, as a price differential compounds over time, and the unfamiliar manufacturer accumulates the track record that makes it familiar. Each year that a Southern producer delivered acceptable shoes at meaningfully lower prices was a year that made the next purchase a little easier to justify. EJ's management understood this dynamic in general terms. What they did not do, what, given the constraints they were operating under, they perhaps could not do, was respond to it with the strategic aggressiveness that might have extended the company's competitive position. The most obvious responses were the ones that the 1920 pledge made essentially unavailable. Open Southern production facilities, shift manufacturing to lower-cost locations, or at minimum develop a genuine operational presence outside the Triple Cities that could compete on price in market segments where EJ's quality premium was not generating sufficient loyalty. These responses were not discussed seriously. The community implications were too severe. The moral costs were, to the Johnson family and to EJ management more broadly, genuinely prohibitive. A company that had defined itself by its relationship to its community simply could not become a company that abandoned that community in pursuit of cheaper labor without ceasing to be, in any meaningful sense, the same company. This is the first place where the tragedy reveals itself in its full complexity. The decision not to move south was not a failure of analysis. It was a considered judgment that certain costs, the human costs, the community costs, the betrayal of the identity that had made EJ what it was, outweighed the competitive benefits of relocation. Reasonable people, weighing the same evidence, could have reached the same conclusion. The tragedy is not that the decision was wrong. The tragedy is that a decision made for coherent reasons had consequences that no amount of good reasoning could prevent. By 1930, EJ's market share in work shoes had declined to approximately 44%, still dominant, still the largest single producer, but measurably down from the peak and moving in a direction that the Great Depression, with its collapse of industrial employment and work shoe demand, would temporarily obscure but not reverse. George F. Johnson continued as an active presence in the company through the 1930s, walking factory floors with the same attentiveness he had shown 40 years earlier, maintaining the personal connection to production and workforce that had always been his primary management tool. Photographs from this period show a heavy-set man in his 70s, suit jacket open, moving through rows of machines with a familiarity that communicated both authority and belonging, the walk of someone who is not visiting a facility but inhabiting it. The Depression years were brutal for the shoe industry generally, and somewhat less brutal for EJ specifically, for reasons that were both a testament to the company's strength and a preview of its future problems. The work shoe market contracted sharply as industrial employment collapsed. Men without factory jobs did not need new work boots. But EJ's established relationships and brand loyalty allowed it to maintain a higher market share of a smaller market than might otherwise have been expected. The profitability declined severely, however, and for the first time the company's benefit structure, the hospital, the parks, the community programs, began to operate as a genuine financial burden rather than a self-financing investment. Johnson's response to the Depression reflected both his values and his limitations. He maintained employment wherever possible, preferring reduced hours and temporary shutdowns to permanent layoffs, a decision that preserved community stability at significant cost to the company's financial reserves. He drew down the cushion that 3 decades of profitability had accumulated, treating it as capital that had been saved for exactly this kind of moment. And he was not wrong about that. The reserves were for emergencies. This was an emergency. What the Depression years did not produce was a fundamental strategic reassessment. The competitive pressures from the South, temporarily relieved as Southern manufacturers suffered equally from the contraction in industrial employment, did not prompt the kind of structural thinking about EJ's long-term position that the situation required. The response to crisis was operational. Maintain the workforce, preserve the community, wait for the market to recover, rather than strategic. The market did recover through the late 1930s and then dramatically through World War II, when military boot contracts provided EJ with a surge of production demand that temporarily restored the scale and profitability of the peak years. The war years looked, financially, like a return to form. They were not. They were a postponement, funded by military procurement, of a reckoning that the post-war economy would eventually demand. George Johnson died in 1948 at 91, still nominally connected to the company, honored with a civic mourning that reflected the genuine depth of feeling he had created in the communities he had built. Schools closed. Factories paused. The Binghamton Press ran a front-page tribute that described him as the closest thing to a genuinely benevolent patriarch that American capitalism had produced. The assessment, while not entirely wrong, missed the complication that was already visible to anyone looking carefully. Johnson had been so thoroughly the company for so long that the company after Johnson was a different entity than the company during Johnson. An entity that had inherited all of his commitments, but none of the specific genius for strategic improvisation that had created them. His sons, George W. and Charles, were capable managers who understood the company's operations with genuine depth. They had grown up inside EJ. They knew the factories, the tanneries, the supply chain, the workforce, the community relationships. What they had not been required to develop, because the company's dominance had made it seem unnecessary, was the capacity for the kind of strategic reinvention that their father had exercised in the founding years. Johnson had built something extraordinary by seeing possibilities that nobody else saw and acting on them before they became obvious. His successors were given the task of running what he had built, a fundamentally different activity, and one that does not develop the same muscles. The American shoe industry underwent 3 structural transformations between 1945 and 1965. Each was visible in advance. Each was discussed in trade publications and analyzed by industry consultants. Each represented a trajectory that, followed to its logical conclusion, pointed toward a radically different competitive environment than the one EJ had been built to dominate. And EJ navigated none of them successfully, not because its management was incompetent, but because each transformation, taken individually, appeared manageable. And the interaction of all 3 together was not something that the company's planning framework was equipped to model. The first transformation was the acceleration of the Southern shift. What had been a modest competitive pressure in the 1920s became a dominant structural reality in the decade after World War II. Southern manufacturers, those in Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas, that had been building capacity and capability throughout the preceding 2 decades, emerged from the war with modern facilities, increasingly skilled workforces, and cost structures that were 40 to 50% below northeastern levels. The quality gap that had protected EJ's premium positioning had largely closed. The price gap had not. By 1952, Southern producers controlled approximately 28% of the work shoe market. By 1958, that number was approaching 40%. The share was coming almost entirely from northeastern manufacturers, and EJ, as the largest northeastern producer, was providing the largest portion of it. The company's response to this competitive pressure was to compete on quality and brand loyalty, maintaining price points above the southern producers while investing in product consistency and retail relationships. This strategy was coherent. It was also insufficient. Retail buyers who purchased on behalf of industrial employers, the mining companies, construction firms, and factory operators who bought work shoes in bulk, were not primarily driven by brand loyalty. They were driven by cost per pair and acceptable quality threshold. As Southern quality rose above that threshold, the price differential became the primary decision factor, and EJ was losing that competition by design. The second transformation was synthetic materials. The development of durable synthetic compounds suitable for shoe construction, beginning with improved rubber and vulcanized materials for soles and progressing through the 1950s toward polymers that could substitute for leather in uppers, represented an existential challenge to a company whose entire production system was organized around natural leather. This is the structural trap that EJ's vertical integration had created, and it deserves careful examination because it is subtle in a way that makes it easy to underestimate. The tanneries were not inefficiencies. They were genuine competitive assets capable of processing leather to EJ's specific quality standards at scale with the consistency that mass production required. But they were assets whose value was contingent on leather remaining the primary material for the type of shoes EJ made. Every percentage point that synthetic materials captured in the work shoe segment was a percentage point that undermined the economic justification for 12 tanneries and everything associated with them. Management faced a choice that had no clean solution. Embrace synthetics aggressively, and you write off decades of tannery investment while conceding the quality differentiation that justified your price premium. Resist synthetics, and you cede market share to producers who are not carrying your legacy costs. EJ chose a middle path: cautious adoption, selected product lines, continued emphasis on leather quality as a marketing position. That was defensible year by year, but that compounded into a significant strategic lag over the full arc of the transformation. The third transformation was automation. New machinery developed primarily by manufacturers in Ohio and Massachusetts could perform the stitching, lasting, and finishing operations that had historically required skilled human labor, with greater consistency and at substantially higher speed. The capital cost of retooling an EJ facility for modern automated production was significant but manageable for a company of EJ's resources. The human cost was not manageable in the same way. Automation at EJ was not simply a technology adoption question. It was a workforce question, a community question, and a question about the meaning of the company itself. The Square deal had been built around the premise that skilled, experienced human labor was the source of EJ's quality advantage. Automation challenged that premise directly. More immediately, automation meant fewer workers, and fewer workers meant dismantling, piece by piece, the community infrastructure that had been built on the assumption of large-scale permanent employment. The hospital served workers, the parks served workers, the profit-sharing served workers. Remove the workers, and you remove the rationale for everything Johnson had built. EJ automated later, more slowly and less completely than competitors who were not carrying the same commitments. The productivity gap this created was real and compounding. Each year of delayed automation was a year in which competitors improved their per-pair production costs, while EJ's remained anchored to the labor-intensive processes that had been optimal in 1930, but were increasingly non-competitive in 1955. Between 1950 and 1965, Endicott Johnson's position in the American shoe market deteriorated in ways that the raw output numbers partially obscured, but that the market share figures made impossible to deny. Annual production, which had peaked at 52 million pairs in 1927 and had recovered to approximately 45 million pairs through the post-war boom, began declining in the mid-1950s, slowly at first, then with a momentum that reflected structural competitive loss rather than cyclical demand fluctuation. By 1960, production had fallen to the low 30s of millions. By 1965, it was below 25 million pairs. By 1968, it had dropped below 15 million. Market share figures were even more stark. From 52% at peak, EJ's share of the work shoe segment had fallen to approximately 31% by 1958. Still the market leader, still by far the largest single producer, but with a trajectory that pointed unmistakably downward. By 1963, the share was below 20%. By 1967, it was estimated at less than 12%. The workforce numbers tracked the production numbers downward, with a lag produced by the company's continued commitment to absorbing contraction through attrition rather than layoffs wherever possible. In 1950, approximately 18,000 workers were employed across EJ operations. By 1960, that number had declined to about 14,000, a reduction that looked, given the production decline, almost modest. By 1965, the workforce had fallen below 10,000. By 1968, it was below 6,000. Each of these numbers represented a family in the Triple Cities whose economic situation had changed or was changing. Each represented a household that had been built around the assumption of EJ employment, a mortgage, a car payment, children in school, now confronting uncertainty that the company's previous stability had made almost unthinkable. The community that EJ had constructed over 60 years was not simply an economic system. It was an expectation, passed from parent to child across multiple generations, that this place and this company would be there. The gradual withdrawal of that certainty created a kind of ambient grief in the Triple Cities that was present for years before the formal collapse, and that shaped the political and social response to it in ways that constrained the available options. Management's response to the financial deterioration through this period was consistently to seek operational solutions to what were structural problems. Cost reduction programs were implemented, then implemented again. Product lines were rationalized. Manufacturing operations were consolidated into the most productive facilities, with less productive ones closed in a sequence that was managed with great care for the human consequences, generous severance where possible, priority placement in remaining EJ facilities, collaboration with union leadership to minimize the disruption to individuals. But that was, for all its care, a slow dismantling of what had been built. The financial trajectory through the early 1960s was, in retrospect, clearly unsustainable. EJ had been a highly profitable operation through most of the 1940s, generating margins that funded the community infrastructure, the profit sharing, and a financial reserve that management believed would cushion whatever transitional difficulties lay ahead. By the late 1950s, those margins had compressed dramatically under the combined pressure of market share loss, cost structure disadvantage, and the fixed costs of maintaining a benefit infrastructure built for a workforce of 20,000 while actually employing half that number. By the mid-1960s, the company was operating near break-even on its core manufacturing operations. By 1967, several of its largest remaining facilities were losing money. The board, in 1969, voted to restructure the company's manufacturing operations, a decision that was, as noted, less a choice than an acknowledgement of an outcome that had already occurred. The manufacturing infrastructure of Endicott Johnson, built over 80 years to produce 52 million pairs of shoes annually, was being wound down. The process would take several more years to complete, but its direction and destination were no longer in question. In most histories of industrial collapse, the community appears late in the epilogue, in photographs of empty streets and declining population statistics as the human backdrop to an economic narrative that has already concluded. The Endicott Johnson story works differently because the community and the company were so thoroughly intertwined that the community's deterioration began while the company was still nominally operating, and the community's distress in turn shaped the company's final years in ways that need to be understood. The first visible signs of the company's retreat from its community commitments appeared in the late 1950s. The free hospital began offering reduced services, then began charging modest fees to workers, then eventually was transferred out of company ownership entirely. The parks that EJ had maintained for decades were handed over to municipal authority, and the municipalities, lacking the resources of a profitable industrial company, were unable to maintain them at the standards EJ had set. The carousels, 3 of them transferred to city management, fell into disrepair that became visible and symbolic in ways that ordinary park deterioration would not have been. The country club ended its free membership for workers in stages, modest fees first, then larger fees, then the elimination of the worker program. These were individually modest reductions. Collectively, they constituted a message that residents of the Triple Cities could read without access to any financial statements. The system that had sustained this community for 60 years was contracting. The support was being withdrawn. The permanence that George Johnson had promised and delivered for 4 decades was not, it turned out, as permanent as it had seemed. The political response was, understandably, pressure. Local elected officials urged EJ to maintain its community commitments, to keep facilities open, to protect employment. The union, the United Shoe Workers, which represented the bulk of EJ's production workforce, pushed for wage increases and benefit protections even as the company's financial situation deteriorated. On the defensive logic that if closures were coming regardless, workers needed to extract maximum compensation while work remained. The social pressure for stasis, for maintaining what existed, for honoring commitments that were becoming economically unsustainable, was enormous and sincere and counterproductive. No individual actor in this dynamic was behaving unreasonably. Management was trying to honor commitments while managing a deteriorating competitive position. Workers and their union representatives were trying to protect themselves using the tools available to them. Politicians were trying to preserve the community their constituents depended on. The result was a collective action problem in which everyone's rational individual response to the situation made the overall outcome worse, accelerating the cost increases that were driving the closures, reducing the flexibility that might have extended the company's viability, making adaptation more difficult at exactly the moment when adaptation was most urgently needed. The last EJ factory complex ran reduced shifts into the early 1970s. The remaining workers, some of them third-generation EJ employees, the grandchildren of people who had been hired by George Johnson himself, were not fired so much as gradually released, as shifts shortened and lines consolidated, and the work that remained became a remnant of what had been. By 1974, manufacturing employment at what had been Endicott Johnson was below 2,000. By 1980, it was effectively zero. The tanneries had closed first, then the wire factory, then the farm had been sold, then the factories themselves had been emptied. The physical structures remained, brick and heavy timber, built to last, built for a scale of operation that would never return. They sat empty through the 1970s and into the 1980s, occasionally occupied by small tenants using fractions of their available space, waiting for reinventions that came slowly and partially. The brand name survived, transferred through a series of acquisitions to companies with no connection to the southern tier of New York. EJ work boots are still manufactured and sold today by companies operating primarily in the southeastern United States and through overseas sourcing. They are decent boots. They carry a name that means nothing to the people who make them, and something deeply specific to the people whose families made shoes in Binghamton. The temptation confronting the Endicott Johnson story is to identify the decision, the single moment of strategic failure from which all subsequent collapse derived, the fork in the road where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. This temptation should be firmly resisted because the search for that decision systematically misrepresents what the story is actually about. The Endicott Johnson collapse was not the result of a mistake. It was the result of a model, a genuinely excellent model, one of the most successful models of industrial capitalism that the United States has ever produced, encountering conditions for which it had not been designed and that it could not adapt to without ceasing to be itself. The lessons it offers are not lessons about what to avoid. They are lessons about what success costs and about the nature of the vulnerability that achievement creates. Lesson 1. Vertical integration encodes assumptions that need to be explicitly identified and periodically examined. EJ's tanneries, its farm, its wire factory, its complete internal supply chain, these were not legacies of managerial inertia. They were strategic choices that had produced genuine and measurable competitive advantages over many decades. The logic of integration was sound. By controlling every stage of production, EJ could maintain quality standards, reduce supply chain vulnerability, and capture value that would otherwise accrue to external suppliers. But vertical integration is a bet on specific inputs remaining valuable. Every dollar EJ invested in leather processing infrastructure was a dollar that would become a liability if leather ceased to be the primary material for the products EJ made. The tanneries were not assets whose value was independent of the market environment. They were conditional assets, valuable under specific conditions, burdensome when those conditions changed. The failure was not building the tanneries. The failure was not building into the company's planning framework an explicit mechanism for periodically reassessing the assumptions that the tanneries encoded. EJ needed, from perhaps the mid-1940s onward, a standing commitment to asking, if we were designing this production system today, knowing what we know about where materials technology is heading, would we still own these tanneries? What is the cost of owning them? What alternatives exist? What would it take to transition? These questions were not asked with sufficient urgency because the tanneries were established facts around which everything else was organized. Established facts are the hardest things to question precisely because so much depends on them. Lesson 2. Values-based strategies are powerful, but only as long as the conditions that make them viable persist. The Square Deal was not just a moral statement. It was, as George Johnson understood from the beginning, a strategy, a specific approach to workforce management that generated measurable competitive advantages through retention, productivity, and quality. The strategy worked because it was suited to its competitive environment, a market where quality differentiation mattered, where skilled human labor was a genuine production advantage, and where EJ's wages represented a meaningful premium over alternatives. All three of those conditions degraded simultaneously between 1950 and 1965. The quality differentiation advantage eroded as Southern producers improved. The premium on skilled human labor declined as automation reduced its relative importance. The wage premium compressed as the Southern labor market developed, and the gap between EJ compensation and available alternatives narrowed. The Square Deal, as a strategy, required periodic recalibration, a willingness to ask what the current version of the commitment should look like given current conditions. But the Square Deal had been transformed over 60 years from a strategy into an identity. and you cannot recalibrate an identity without ceasing to be the thing the identity describes. This is the deepest trap in EJ's story. The very success of the strategy had made it unavailable for revision. Lesson 3. The relationship between a company and its community can become a strategic constraint as well as a competitive advantage. George Johnson's community investment was not a corporate social responsibility program in the modern sense, a reputational gesture calculated to generate goodwill. It was a fundamental element of the company's competitive model, producing real returns through workforce retention, regional talent attraction, and the political and social stability that deep community roots provided. But it also created, over time, a set of obligations and expectations that constrained EJ's strategic options in ways that became increasingly costly as the competitive environment deteriorated. The 1920 pledge was the most visible of these constraints, but it was not the only one. The entire fabric of the company's relationship to the Triple Cities, the hospital, the parks, the carousels, the generations of families who had organized their lives around EJ employment, created a set of moral obligations that were real and weighty and that made certain available strategic responses effectively unavailable. A company with no community attachments, facing the same competitive pressures EJ faced in the 1950s, would have had clear and painful but survivable options. Southern expansion, overseas sourcing, workforce reduction, asset sale, merger. EJ considered all of these options and found each of them, for different reasons, impossible to implement without destroying something essential about what the company was. The community investment that had been a strength in the growth years became a constraint in the contraction years, not because the investment had been wrong, but because circumstances had changed in ways that the investment's architects had not anticipated. Lesson 4. A company can be too excellent at one specific thing. This is the most uncomfortable lesson because it implies that extraordinary success carries its own specific risk, a risk that mediocrity does not carry. EJ was extraordinarily good at making leather work shoes using skilled human labor, organized around a specific set of values and relationships developed over 80 years. The excellence was real. The quality, the workforce culture, the operational systems, the community integration, none of it was illusory. But excellence in a specific domain is always contingent on that domain's continued relevance. When the domain, leatherwork shoes, northeastern manufacturing, the premium on skilled human labor, became less central to the competitive landscape, EJ's excellence became a form of organizational specificity that limited its ability to become excellent at anything else. The capabilities, the culture, the institutional knowledge, the physical infrastructure, all of it was optimized for one thing, and one thing only. The companies that survived the transformation of American shoe manufacturing were not the ones that were best at the old model. They were the ones that had maintained enough organizational flexibility, enough separation between their capabilities and their identity to recognize the new model and move toward it. Competence with adaptability outlasted excellence without it. The margin of safety in industrial competition, it turns out, is not built by doing one thing extraordinarily well. It is built by retaining the capacity to become a different kind of company when circumstances require it. The carousel on Washington Avenue still turns. It was restored in 2008 through a nonprofit effort funded partly by former EJ employees and their descendants, people who understood, in a way that resists easy explanation, that the carousel was not merely a historical artifact but a living statement about what had been possible here and about the refusal to let that possibility be entirely forgotten. The restoration required years of fundraising and negotiation and volunteer labor. The people who did it were not primarily motivated by nostalgia, though nostalgia was present. They were motivated by something more specific, a belief that what George Johnson had built deserved to be remembered accurately, which meant remembered as something more than a failure. Drive through Endicott on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and you will see the factories. Block after block of brick industrial architecture, some of it converted, most of it still waiting. A former factory that now houses a business incubator employs perhaps 300 people in a building that once employed 3,000. Another has been converted to apartments. Several have been demolished. Most stand intact, their proportions communicating a scale of ambition and production that has no contemporary equivalent in the region. The windows that remain intact reflect the sky. The loading docks that once handled the departure of millions of pairs of shoes are quiet. The triple cities, Binghamton, Endicott, Johnson City, have not recovered from the loss of EJ in any way that the word recovery usually implies. Population has declined from post-war peaks. The economic base that EJ provided has not been replaced by any single successor. The region has, like many post-industrial communities in the northeastern United States, developed a complex and partial economic life organized around healthcare, education, government services, and the remnants of other manufacturing. A life that is real and in many respects resilient, but that operates at a smaller scale and with less certainty than the world EJ created. What EJ built was specific to its moment, specific to a set of conditions, material and economic and social, that obtained for a particular window of time in a particular corner of American history. George Johnson's genius was in seeing within those conditions what was possible and building it. His achievement was real. The community he created was genuinely better for several generations of working people than it would have been under a conventional industrial arrangement. The wages were higher. The medical care was real. The parks were beautiful. The carousels turned. What couldn't be preserved, ultimately, was not the commitment, but the conditions under which the commitment was sustainable. The leather gave way to synthetics. The skilled hand gave way to the automated machine. The northeastern wage structure gave way to the southern cost advantage. These were not failures of will or failures of vision. They were the ordinary metabolism of industrial change, moving at a pace and in directions that even a company as sophisticated and as committed as Endicott Johnson could not outrun. The deepest truth of this story may be that some achievements are unrepeatable, not because the people who created them were uniquely brilliant, though Johnson was, but because they were uniquely suited to a specific convergence of circumstances that cannot be reconstructed once it has passed. You cannot build another Endicott Johnson because you cannot rebuild the conditions that made it possible. The hemlock forests are logged. The immigrant labor pool has dispersed. The era of craft manufacturing that gave skilled hands their premium is over. The window through which Johnson saw his possibility and walked through it closed behind him. What remains is the carousel and the factories standing patient in the autumn light, and the memory carried by families across generations of a time when a shoe company in upstate New York proved, for several extraordinary decades, that it was possible to build something large and profitable and genuinely good, and that the world, in the end, was not required to make room for it forever.